Continuing Nicias from Plutarch's Lies, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. The phone dropped, and I'm not sure exactly what moment I stopped, so we find testimony in the comic writers as when Teleclides, speaking of one of the professed informers, says, Charicles gave the man £1, the matter not to name, that from inside a money bag into the world he came, and Nicias also paid him 4. I know the reason well, but Nicias is a worthy man, and so I will not tell. So also the informer, whom Eupolis introduces in his Maricas, attacking a good simple poor man. How long ago did you and Nicias meet? I did but see him just now in the street. The man has seen him, and denies it not. 'Tis evident that they are in a plot. See you, O citizens, 'tis fact, Nicias is taken in the act. Taken, fools, take so good a man. In aught that's wrong, none will or can. And presumably the rhyme is much different, if anything, right? Cleon in Aristophanes makes it one of his threats. I'll out-scream all the speakers and make Nicias stand aghast. Phrynicus also implies his want of spirit and his easiness to be intimated in the verses. A noble man he was, I well can say, nor walk like Nicias, cowering on his way. So cautious was he of informers, and so reserved, that he never would dine out with any citizen, nor allowed himself to indulge in talk and conversation with his friends, nor give himself any leisure for such amusements, but when he was general, he used to stay at the office till night, and was the first that came into the council house, and the last that left it. And if no business engaged him, it was very hard to have access, or to speak with him, he being retired at home and locked up. And when any came to the door, some friend of his gave them good words, and begged them to excuse him. Nicias was very busy, as if affairs of state and public duties still kept him occupied. He who principally acted this part for him, and contributed most to this state and show, was Hero, a man educated in Nicias's family, and instructed by him in letters and music. He professed to be son of Dionysius, surnamed Calchas, whose poems are yet extant, and he led out the colony to Italy and founded Thuril. This Hero transacted all his secrets for Nicias with the diviners, and gave out to the people what a toilsome and miserable life he led for the sake of the commonwealth. He, said Hero, can never be either at the bath or at his meat, but some public business interferes. Careless of his own and zealous for the public good, he scarcely ever goes to bed till after others have had their first sleep. The first sleep as in, at dusk, maybe people perform a ritual or something and then they go to sleep. And then, they probably wake up in a few hours, and that's why there was middle of the night church services and stuff like that, as a standard thing for quite some time. Is that, particularly when it wasn't the summer, the nights were long enough that people, were up for a bit. So if they were up for a couple hours in the middle of the night, they head off to church or something. So that his health is impaired and his body out of order, nor is he cheerful or affable with his friends, but loses them as well as his money in the service of the state, while other men gain friends by public speaking, enrich themselves, fare delicately, and make government their amusement. And in fact this was Nicias's manner of life, so that he well might apply to himself the words of Agamemnon. Vain pomps the ruler of the life we live, and a slave's service to the crowd we give. Or at least it puts the people on the church property, keeps them from misbehaving, or the monks from going out and misbehaving if they have to, come back in the middle of the night. He observed that the people, in the case of men of eloquence, are of eminent parts, make use of their talents upon occasion, and were always jealous of their abilities, and held a watchful eye upon them, taking all opportunities to humble their pride and abate their reputation, as was manifest in their condemnation of Pericles, their banishment of Damon, and their distrust of Antiphon the Ramnasian, but especially in the case of Pachus, or Paches, who took Lesbos, who, having to give account of his conduct in the very court of justice, unsheathed his sword and slew himself. Upon such considerations Nicias declined all difficult and lengthy enterprises. If he took a command, he was for doing what was safe, and if, as thus was likely, he had for the most part success, he did not attribute it to any wisdom, conduct, or courage of his own, but to avoid envy. He thanked fortune for all, and gave the glory to the divine powers, and the actions themselves bore testimony in his favor. The city met at that time with several considerable reverses, but he had not a hand in any of them. The Athenians were routed in Thrace by the Chalcidians, Calliadus and Xenophon commanding in chief. Demosthenes was the general when they were unfortunate in Attalia. At Delium they lost 1,000 citizens under the conduct of Hippocrates. The plague was principally laid to the charge of Pericles, he to carry on the war, having shut up close together in the town the crowd of people from the country who, by the change of pace and of their usual course of living, bred the pestilence. Nicias, to clear of all this, under his conduct was taken Cathera, an island most commodious against Laconia, and occupied by the Lacedaemonian settlers. Many places likewise in Thrace, which had revolted, were taken or won over by him. He, shutting up the Megarians within their town, seized upon the isle of Minoa, and soon after advancing from thence to Nicias, making himself master there, and then making a descent upon the Corinthian territory, fought a successful battle, and slew a great number of Corinthians, with their captain Locophron. There it happened that 2 of his men were left by an oversight, when they carried off the dead, which when he understood, he stopped the fleet, and sent a herald to the enemy for leave to carry off the dead, though by law and custom he that by a truce craved leave to carry off the dead was hereby supposed to give up all claim to the victory. Nor was it lawful for him that did this to erect a trophy, for his is the victory, who is master of the field, and is not master who asks leave, as wanting power to take, but he chose rather to renounce his victory, and his glory than to let 2 citizens lie unburied. He scoured the coast of Laconia all along, and beat the Lacedaemonians that made head against him. He took Therea, occupied by the Aeginetans, and carried the prisoners to Athens. And generally, for multiple reasons, spiritual, physical, psychological, it's not good to transport the bodies out of the locality where they died. When Demosthenes had fortified Pallas and the Peloponnesians brought together both their sea and land forces before it. After the fight, about the number of 400 native Spartans were left ashore in the Isle of Sphacteria. The Athenians thought it a great prize, as indeed it was, to take these men prisoners, but the siege in places that wanted water, being very difficult and untoward, and to convey necessaries about by sea in summer tedious and expensive, in winter doubtful, or plainly impossible, they began to be annoyed, and to repent their having rejected the embassy of the Lacedaemonians that had been sent to propose a treaty of peace, which had been done at the importunity of Cleon, who opposed it chiefly out of a pique to Nicias for being his enemy, and observing him to be extremely solicitous to support the offers of the Lacedaemonians, he persuaded the people to refuse them. Now, therefore, that the siege was protracted, and they heard of the difficulties that pressed their army, they grew enraged against Cleon, but he turned all the blame upon Nicias, charging it on his softness and cowardice that the besieged were not yet taken. Were I general, said he, they should not hold out so long. The Athenians not unnaturally asked the question, why then, as it is, do you not go with the squadron against them? And Nicias, standing up, resigned his command, Pallas, to him, and bade him take what forces he pleased along with him, and not be bold in words, out of harm's way, but go forth and perform some real service for the Commonwealth. Cleon, at the first, tried to draw back, disconcerted at the proposal, which he had never expected, but the Athenians insisting, and Nicias loudly upbraiding him, he, thus provoked and fired with ambition, took upon him the charge, and said further that within 20 days after he embarked, he would either kill the enemy upon the place, or bring them alive to Athens. This the Athenians were readier to laugh at than to believe, as on other occasions also his bold assertions and extravagances used to make them sport, and were pleasant enough. For instance, it is reported that once, when the people were assembled, and had waited his coming a long time, at last he appeared with a garland on his head, and prayed them to adjourn to the next day. For, said he, I am not at leisure today. I have sacrificed to the entities, and am to entertain some strangers. Whereupon the Athenians, laughing, rose up and dissolved the assembly. However, at this time he had good fortune, in conjunction with Demosthenes, conducted the enterprise so well that within the time he had limited, he carried captive to Athens all the Spartans that had not fallen in battle. This brought great disgrace on Nicias, for this was not to throw away his shield, but something yet more shameful and ignominious, to quit his charge voluntarily out of cowardice, and voting himself, as it were, out of his command of his own accord, to put into his enemy's hand the opportunity of achieving so brave an action. Aristophanes has a jest against him on this occasion in the Birds. Indeed, not now the word that must be said is do like Nicias, or retire to bed. And again in his Husbandman, I wish to stay at home and farm. What then? Who should prevent you, you, my countrymen, whom I would pay 1,000 drachmas down, to let me give up office and leave town? Enough content the sum 2,000 is, with those that Nicias paid to give up his. Besides all this, he did great mischief to the city, by suffering the accession of so much reputation and power to Cleon, who now assumed such lofty airs, and allowed himself in such intolerable audacity to lead to many unfortunate results, a sufficient part of which fell to his own share. Amongst other things, he destroyed all the decorum of public speaking. He was the first who ever broke out into exclamations flung open his dress, smote his thigh, and ran up and down whilst he was speaking, things which soon after introduced, amongst those who managed the affairs of state, such license and contempt of decency as brought all into confusion. Well, whether that's, well, this is kind of crazy, right? Getting naked and slapping yourself. Well, it was his leg, but, or maybe that was metaphor, but either way, already too, Alcibiades was beginning to show his strength at Athens, a popular leader, not indeed as utterly violent as Cleon, but as the land of Egypt. Through the richest of its soil, it is said, great plenty to produce, both wholesome herbs and drugs of deadly juice. So the nature of Alcibiades was strong and luxuriant in both kinds, and made way for many serious innovations. Thus it fell out that after Nicias had got his hands clear of Cleon, he had not opportunity to settle the city perfectly into quietness, for having brought matters to a pretty hopeful condition, he found everything carried away and plunged again into confusion by Alcibiades, through the wilderness and vehemence of his ambition, and all embroiled again in war, worse than ever, which fell out thus: the persons who had principally hindered the peace were Cleon and Brasidas, war setting off the virtue of the one and hiding the villainy of the other, gave to the one occasions of achieving brave actions, to the other opportunity of committing equal dishonesties. Now, when these two were in one battle, both slain under Amphipolis, Nicias was aware that the Spartans had long been desirous of a peace, and that the Athenians had no longer the same confidence in the war, both being alike tired, and, as it were, by consent, letting fall their hands. He therefore, in his nick of time, employed his efforts to make a friendship betwixt the two cities, and to deliver the other states of Greece from the evils and calamities they labored under, and so establish his own good name for success as a statesman for all future time. He found the men of substance, the elder men, and the landowners and farmers pretty generally all inclined to peace, and when, in addition to these, by conversing and reasoning, he had cooled the wishes of a good many others for war, he now encouraged the hopes of the Lacedaemonians, and counseled them to seek peace. They confided in him, as on account of his general character for moderation and equity, so also because of the kindness and care he had shown to the prisoners taken at Pallas and kept in confinement, making their misfortune the more easy to them. The Athenians and the Spartans had before this concluded a truce for a year, and during this, by associating with one another, they had tasted again the sweets of peace and security and unimpeded intercourse with friends and connections, and thus longed for an end of that fighting and bloodshed, and heard with delight the chorus sing such verses as, my lance I'll leave laid by for spiders to o'erweave, and remembered with joy the saying in peace, they who sleep are awaked by the cock-crow, not by the trumpet. So shutting their ears with loud reproaches to the forebodings of those who said that the fates decreed this to be a war of thrice 9 years, the whole question having been debated, they made a peace. And most people thought now indeed they had got an end of all their evils, and Nicias was in every man's mouth as one especially beloved of what they considered to be gods and goddesses, who, for his piety and devotion, had been appointed to give a name to the fairest and greatest of all blessings, for in fact they considered the peace Nicias' work as the war the work of Pericles, because he, on light occasions, seemed to have plunged the Greeks into great calamities, while Nicias had induced them to forget all the evils they had done each other, and to be friends again, and so to this day it is called the Peace of Nicias. The articles being that the garrisons and towns taken on either side and the prisoners should be restored, and they to restore the first to whom it should fall by lot, Nicias, as Theophrastus tells us, by a sum of money procured that the lot should fall for the Lacedaemonians to deliver the first. Afterwards, when the Corinthians and the Boeotians showed their dislike of what was done, and by their complaints and accusations were well nigh bringing the war back again, Nicias persuaded the Athenians and the Lacedaemonians, besides the peace, to make a treaty of alliance, offensive and defensive, as a tie of confirmation of the peace, which would make them more terrible to those that held out, and the former to each other. Whilst these matters were on foot, Alcibiades, who was no lover of tranquillity, and who was offended with the Lacedaemonians because of their applications and attentions to Nicias, while they overlooked and despised himself from first to last. Indeed, he had opposed the peace, though all in vain, but now finding that the Lacedaemonians did not altogether continue to please the Athenians, but were thought to have acted unfairly in having made a league with the Boeotians, and had not given up Panactum, as they should have done, with its fortifications unrazed, nor yet Amphipolis, he laid hold on these occasions for his purpose, and availed him of every one of them to irritate the people, and at length, sending for ambassadors from the Argives, he exerted himself to effect a confederacy between the Athenians and them. And now when Lacedaemonian ambassadors were come with full powers, and at their preliminary audience by the council seemed to come in all points with just proposals, he, fearing that the General Assembly also would be won to their offers, overreached them with false professions and oaths of assistance, on the condition that they would not avow that they came with full powers. This, he said, being the only way for them to attain their desires. They being overpersuaded and decoyed from Nicias to follow him, he introduced them to the assembly, and asked them presently whether or no they came in all points with full powers, which, when they denied, he, contrary to their expectation, changing his countenance, called the council to witness with the words, and now bade the people beware how they trust or transact anything with such manifest liars, who say at one time one thing, and at another the very opposite upon the same subject. These plenipotentiaries were, as well they might be, confounded at this, and Nicias also being at a loss that to say, and struck with amazement and wonder, the assembly resolved to send immediately for the Argives, to enter into a league with them. An earthquake, which interrupted the assembly, made for Nicias' advantage, and the next day the people being again assembled, after much speaking and soliciting, with great ado he brought it about that the treaty with the Argives should be deferred, and he be sent to the Lacedaemonians in full expectation, so that all would go well. When he arrived at Sparta, they received him there as a good man, and one well inclined towards them. Yet he effected nothing, but baffled by the party that favored the Boeotians, he returned home, not only dishonored and hardly spoken of, but likewise in fear of the Athenians, who were vexed and enraged that, through his persuasions, they had released so many and such considerable persons, their prisoners, for the men who had been brought from Pallas were of the chiefest families of Sparta, and had those who were highest there in place and power for their friends and kindred. Yet they did not in their heat proceed against him, otherwise than that they chose Alcibiades general, and took the Mantineans and Eleans, who had thrown up their alliance with the Lacedaemonians, into the league, together with the Argives, and sent to Pallas freebooters to infest Laconia, whereby the war began to break out afresh, but the enmity betwixt Nicias and Alcibiades running higher and higher, and the time being at hand for decreeing the ostracism or banishment for 10 years, which the people putting the name on a shirt were wont to inflict at certain times on some person suspected or regarded with jealousy for his popularity or wealth. Both were now in alarm and apprehension, one of them, in all likelihood, being to undergo this ostracism, as the people abominated the life of Alcibiades, and stood in fear of his boldness and resolution, as is shown particularly in the history of him, while as for Nicias, his riches made him envied, and his habits of living, in particular his unsociable and exclusive ways, not like those of fellow citizens, or even a fellow man, went against him, and having many times opposed their inclinations, forcing them against their feelings to do what was their interest, he had got himself disliked. And, the side issue really, but one of the things that I believe in is the extra testimony, the guardian or whatever context is somebody testifying that something's, that not only is the woman consenting to marriage, but it's in her interests, and this is whether or not according to likes or dislikes, and a judge, if put in that position, should not, implement their own tastes in the matter either. And same thing in other matters as a judge. If you're judging people, it's not whether they like it or not, it's whether it's the good thing. To speak plainly, it was a contest of the young men who were eager for war against the men of years and lovers of peace. They turned the ostracism upon the one, these upon the other. But in civil strife, e'en villains rise to fame. And so now it happened that the city, distracted in two factions, allowed free course to the most impudent and profligate persons, among whom was Hyperbolus of the Perathoida, one who could not indeed be said to be presuming upon any power, but rather by his presumption rose into power, and by the honor he found in the city became the scandal of it. He at this time thought himself far enough from the ostracism, as more properly deserving the slave's gallows, and made account that one of these men being dispatched out of the way, he might be able to play a part against the other that should be left, and openly showed his pleasure at the dissension and his desire to inflame the people against both of them. Nicias and Alcibiades, perceiving his malice, secretly combined together, and setting both their interests jointly at work, succeeded in fixing the ostracism, not on either of them, but even on Hyperbolus. This indeed at the first made sport and raised laughter amongst the people, but afterwards it was felt as an affront that the thing should be dishonored by being employed upon so unworthy a subject, punishment also having its proper dignity, and ostracism being one that was appropriate rather for Thucydides, Aristides, and such like persons, whereas for Hyperbolus it was a glory and a fair ground for boasting on his part, for when his villainy he suffered the same with the best men, as Plato the comic poet said of him, the man deserved the fate, deny who can, yes, but the fate did not deserve the man. Not for the like of him and his slave brands did Athens put the sherd into our hands, and as in fact none ever afterwards suffered this sort of punishment, but Hyperbolus was the last, as Hipparchus the Colargian, who was kin to the tyrant, was the first. There is no judgment to be made of fortune, nor can any reasoning bring us to certainty about it. If Nicias had run the risk with Alcibiades, whether of the two should undergo the ostracism, he had either prevailed, and his rival being expelled from the city, he had remained secure or being overcome. He had avoided the utmost disasters and preserved the reputation of a most excellent commander. Meantime, I am not ignorant that Theophrastus says that when Hyperbolus was banished, Phaeax, not Nicias, contested it with Alcibiades, but most authors differ from him. It was Alcibiades, at any rate, whom, when the Augustan and Leontine ambassadors arrived and urged the Athenians to make an expedition against Sicily, Nicias opposed, and by whose persuasions and ambition he found himself overborne, who, even before the people could be assembled, had preoccupied and corrupted their judgment with hopes and with speeches, insomuch that the young men at their sports and the old men in their workshops and sitting together on the benches would be drawing maps of Sicily and making charts showing the seas, the harbors, and the general character of the coast of the island opposite Africa, for they made not Sicily the end of the war, but rather its starting point and headquarters from whence they might carry it into the Carthaginians and possess themselves out of Africa and of the seas as far as the Pillars of Hercules. The bulk of the people, therefore, pressing this way, Nicias, who opposed them, found but few supporters, nor those of much influence, for the men of substance, fearing lest they should seem to shun the public charges, and the ship money, were quite against their inclination. Nevertheless, he did not tire nor give it up, but even after the Athenians decreed a war, and chose him in the first place general, together with Alcibiades and Lamachus, when they were again assembled, he stood up, dissuaded them, and protested against this decision, and laid blame on Alcibiades, changing him with going about to involve the city in foreign dangers and difficulties, merely with a view to his own private lucre and ambition. And one of the things is that Latin is not pronounced the same as Italian. You know, all those C's are K sounds. And Greek also not. So I'm trying to give it an approximated Greek sound based on the things. Of course, Hercules, you wouldn't say E's.